Well, hello everybody, and good evening, and welcome to this celebration discussion of Professor Lyndsey Stonebridge's remarkable new book, Writing and Writing, Literature in the Age of Human Rights, which has just been released by Oxford University Press. It's a real pleasure and honor for me to host this event, and after some brief housekeeping, I want to introduce Lyndsey so that we can get on without further ado to the panel discussion. And then I'll be back just before the Q&A to offer some remarks of my own. There I won't attempt to sum up the panel's discussion, but I will touch on how in this incisive, thrifty book, Lyndsey speaks not only to our geopolitical present, but also to the very condition of criticism itself, as literary studies, as so many other fields in the humanities are doing, continues to deliberate on the contours of its own intellectual, political, and practical mission in the world. So a brief outline of the format for this evening, then I'll shortly hand over to Lyndsey, who will speak to some of her book's main contentions and contexts, before then introducing our stellar interdisciplinary panel of speakers. Those speakers will then have a discussion for around about 40 minutes, chaired by Lyndsey herself, who will offer a series of questions to structure the conversation. And then for the last 20 minutes, so around 7:10 onwards, we'll open up things to the audience. For now, in the interests of giving everybody on the panel your sort of undivided attention, could I just ask people to sit back, relax, and keep in mind your comments as the panel unfolds, rather than immediately posting them on the chat. Once the panel have drawn their discussions to a close, then please do feel free to barrage me with questions, and I'll do my best to work through them in the time that we have left. First on, let me introduce my colleague Lyndsey Stonebridge, who holds a prestigious interdisciplinary chair at the University of Birmingham, where she is Professor of Humanities and Human Rights. Lyndsey is author most recently of Placeless People, published by OUP in 2018, and winner of the 2019 Modernist Studies Association Book Prize. Her previous works include The Juridical Imagination from Edinburgh in 2011, which won the British Academy's Rosemary Crawshay Prize in 2014. The Destructive Element and Reading Melanie Klein, the latter with John Phillips, both from 1998. The Destructive Element and Reading Melanie Klein, sorry, there's both from 1998. The Writing Anxiety from 2007, and the superb edited collection, British Fiction After Modernism, which he co-edited with Marina Mackay, also in 2007. Lyndsey's eagerly awaited next book will be a critical and creative work called Thinking Like Hannah Arendt, published by Jonathan Cape in 2022. I'm really delighted to welcome such a large and varied audience this evening to discuss a book that could not be more urgent. Thank you, and over to you, Lyndsey.
Thank you, David, and thank you to Matt Cluley and our brilliant comms team for making this evening happen. And welcome, everybody. I'm so grateful and humbled by the time you've given to join us in a year and a term where I've seen far too many of us on Zoom far too often. I want first to introduce our guests, and I'm going to very, very quickly say just a couple of words about the essay collection, which is Writing and Writing. As I looked at the sign-up list for this evening, this is a topic with really wide appeal. So there are students here, there are academics, there are human rights lawyers, there are activists, there are publishers, agents, politicians, which suggests, I think, that very many of us, to quote Ernest Bloch, currently really feel that sense, and this is a quote from Bloch, that something important is not right. Something important is not right. So my guests this evening reflect this very, very broad concern. Lisa Appignanesi OBE has been fighting tirelessly for the rights of writers and the writing of rights for over 40 years. She's former president of English Pen, and she's led campaigns for both free expression and for free movement. And as current, just for another week, I think, chair of the Royal Society of Literature, has been a really important champion for literature as a public good. But as a writer, Lisa is one of the most foremost advocates for the right to have a complex life, particularly for women to have a complex life. In her histories of psychiatry, psychoanalysis, law, and most recently in her extraordinary memoir, Everyday Madness. Tom Keenan is Associate Professor at Bard College in the US, and he joins us from New York. Tom is a pioneer in the field of humanities and human rights. He's Bard's Human Rights Project Director, as well as running the degree program there, and is currently working on new initiatives on human rights and the arts with the Open Society University Network, and hopefully we'll hear more about that this evening. A writer and an activist, Tom is particularly brilliant at showing how the arts and new media can transform what it means to witness, and so sometimes to collectively resist human rights violations. He's also particularly brilliant at reminding us about the active political obligations of human rights work. Singh, Professor of Creative Writing and Inclusion in the Arts at London Metropolitan University, a novelist. She's the author of the genuinely wicked Nanny's Book of Suicides and of Hotel Arcadia, as well as a writer of creative non-fiction and a film historian. I think it's difficult to think of someone who's done more in the UK recently to bring writing and social justice together by creating truly global solidarities and alliances. I also should say that Singh teaches at my alma mater, which was once known as North London Poly, is now London Met, an institution which has a proud history of inclusion and strategic troublemaking, and it is the place where I first learnt that reading literature was a serious way of thinking about political and social justice. And I think there are a lot of overclaims made about literature and human rights, and we'll touch on some of these this evening. But I'm going to hold on to those North London Poly lessons, I think, until my dying breath. Okay, I just want to say a few things about the book. And in fact, it was in a classroom that the essays in this book originated. Back in 2011, I taught a course on literature and human rights, along with the 18th century scholar Ross Wilson at the University of East Anglia. And that course was a response to new critical work in the humanities on human rights, such as in history by Samuel Moyne and then Hunt, and in literature by people like James Dawes, Elizabeth Anker, and the hugely inspirational and important work of Joseph Slaughter. Now, we began that course in the 18th century and ended it in the present because one of the claims we were making, and it's a claim I repeat in the book, that apparently modern ideas about rights and writing often carry with them the legacies of older traditions about rights, such as ideas around natural rights, dignity, and moral sympathy, which could of course be great things, but were also and are also entangled with the histories of capitalism, colonialism, and the long histories of economic and political inequality. Now, the context behind much of that new academic work in the early noughties in universities was something of an existential crisis, both in the US and in Australia, and also in the UK and Europe, about the moral authority of human rights that began in the mid-noughties. The Second Iraq War, Afghanistan, widespread torture, Guantanamo, proxy and then drone warfare, along with some pretty scandalous abuses of power by NGOs, had all, and I'm putting this mildly, put the moral authority of humanitarian intervention and Western human rights into profound question. As Naomi Klein was, I think, the first to argue, sometimes in that period it also seemed that human rights was more complicit with neoliberal agendas than working against them, whilst other long-standing, particularly third world fights for justice and equality were once again thrown into the shade. By the end of the first decade then of the century, of 2010, 2011, it seemed like it was time to start taking critical stock. But just as that stock taking was happening in the academy, as those of you who work in law and activism will know, into the second decade of the 2000s came, and I'm tempted to say rushed, perhaps the most blatant and widespread attacks on the idea of human rights, and very seriously, not just on human rights themselves, but on the very idea and ethos of human rights that I think we've seen since the last century. So just here in the UK, in the 2014 UK elections, some of you will remember the Conservative Party took direct aim at the 1998 Human Rights Act, paving the way for the casual trashing of international human rights law, and indeed of international law that's marked the politics of Brexit ever since. Hostile environment, Windrush, and I would add Grenfell were not far behind. In India, Hungary, Brazil, Israel, Myanmar, France just last month, as well as in the UK, Australia and the US, this is a very long list, policies targeting minorities, particularly migrants, threw off what covert shame they might have had and decided to go naked with their punitive desire for human degradation. In the US, children were put in cages, whilst Europe devised violent new means of pushing refugees back, whilst pretending it was doing nothing of the sort. There is now, and I think many human rights lawyers would agree with me, a new impunity in our world. That's now. Hannah Arendt, a writer who guides me through much of this book, a thinker who guides me through much of this book, once defined crimes against humanity, and I think it's a brilliant definition. So she once defined crimes against humanity as crimes against human diversity itself, crimes against human diversity. If we think too about the climate catastrophe and not just about human diversity, but crimes against the diversity of life itself, we also know that all this is just the beginning of what is coming down the road. So that's the context. And so this is our question for tonight. How is writing, how is literature, how are the arts responding to these political, ethical, and existential crises for human rights? Now, the provocation I offer in the book is that the idea that we read in order to generate empathy for other people, which is a commonplace you hear an awful lot. The idea that we read in order to generate empathy for people who are apparently not like ourselves has been oversold. There is, I think, a literary humanitarianism that's crept into our thinking about writing that's not really helping us understand either the terms of modern injustice. And one of the things I'm really interested in is the new crimes, the new ways we find to hurt each other take a long time to get recognized as crimes. This is something quite peculiar, I think, to the human rights landscape. And it's not helping us understand the way that new forms of injustice and forms of injustice take place, or understand the depth of our current crisis. Worse still, that empathetic argument reproduces hierarchies, old hierarchies that go back to traditions where the few had the right to imagine the rights of the many, that blunt the charge of the ethical and creative imaginations that are, I would argue, the condition of a genuine politics of human rights. To put it bluntly, we often hear about the need for empathy whilst forgetting why we need to imagine lives more wretched than our own in the first place. Or that sometimes apparently unsympathetic literature, unempathetic literature, books that don't play the empathy game. And I'm thinking here recently, particularly of Tsitsi Dangaremba's a recent masterpiece, A Mournable Body, might give us a truer measure of the world. Pity, Arendt says, is a perversion of true compassion. Pity is a perversion of true compassion. It generalizes and falsely universalizes the suffering of other people to shore up imaginative and ultimately political power. The alternative to pity, Arendt also says, is solidarity. A solidarity that she argues is based on the specifics of each human encounter, on reason, on dialogue, on consensus, on dissensus, on politics, and on the constructing of mutual rights out of difference and diversity. So here's our central question for this evening. What kinds of critical solidarity can we find in writing today? Where can we find it? I have some suggestions about that I make in the book, but I'm quite happy to share with you tonight as well. And how can these kind of solidarities help us to reimagine the human rights we so urgently need now? So that's some of the context, and I'd just like to invite some of my guests to come in on these questions. I'd like to start with Lisa Appignanesi. Lisa, I just lost my notes. Lisa, as I said in the introduction, you've been promoting the relationship between literature and rights now for well over 30 years. I can remember the first time I saw you at the ICA, just in the middle of the Rushdie scandal. And for your time at the ICS, your crucial work on freedom of expression and repealing blasphemy, to your presidency of PEN and now at the RSL. Looking back over that period of 30 to 40 years, to what extent do you think writers today see themselves as doing human rights work in their writing? And how has this maybe changed over the years?
It's a very difficult question, Lyndsey. The reason it's difficult is that writers and their writing are not the same thing. And whereas as critics, I mean, you as a critic, when I'm being a critic, will see certain things in work. I mean, for example, Balzac, who always seems to me to be a great progressive. In his own life, Balzac was a reactionary and a royalist, and not at all progressive for his time. I only mention that because I don't want to talk about now in that way, but it's quite clear that if you're attempting to initiate what you would call human rights work with writers, that's not going to be the same as using what they have written in order to consolidate ideas about rights. Just because they're not the same. Now, I have spent, as you rightly say, quite a lot of time working with writers. I am a writer. I've written fiction and nonfiction and memoir, which combines both of these. And I know very well that the way my work is interpreted is not necessarily what I have initially set out to do. I don't think that the interpretations are wrong, but they're just other. So I mention that because getting writers together to do anything is not simple. Writers don't necessarily agree with each other. They may agree about something that's very, very far away. They won't necessarily agree about what's close to hand. Where I have most experience, and if you want me to talk from that experience, is in that very tricky area, or certainly now it's a very tricky area, to do with free expression, or what we call free speech. The reason it's tricky is that free expression, of course, is crucial to writers in the making of literature of any kind, even though, as we all know, expression is never totally free. We know that even from the analytic couch, there are resistances to all kinds of expression, and we move around within that. But the very term free expression has been co-opted by the right wing, indeed now the alt-right, so that it's become a kind of banner that you wave precisely to score opposite points from what most writers would like to do, or many writers would like to do, which is that, it's become a justification for hate speech rather than for liberating forms of speech or complex forms of speech. And so the free expression banner itself is now tainted. But you asked me to look at history, and I just want to do a very quick scamper. You stop me when it's far too long, but in my initial days as somebody who thought about literature or worked within it or wrote it, something to do with it, we were really in the domain of Samizdat and the Cold War. And so, of course, it was quite clear that free expression was crucial, and because it was free expression for writers who were being persecuted by their own states, by their own regimes, and not being allowed or enabled to publish their work. Their work was not free. So Samizdat became a kind of, something that we all felt should be published, and we could stand up for that. It was elsewhere, it was the Cold War, and that took care of a lot of problems. We could all be free expression advocates. Roll along the years, and of course, we come to that other kind of demarcating moment, if you like, which is the Rushdie affair in 1989. After a period when both Britain and the US had been caught up in a kind of, I don't know, the beginnings of what became high libertarian politics, both here and there, and indeed elsewhere. And the Satanic Verses, I mean, I just remind people of this because it's quite often forgotten. The Satanic Verses not only provoked book burnings in Britain, which is, you know, something we never thought would happen, but provoked them by people who had been exactly the subjects of what Salman Rushdie himself had been involved in campaigns for. In other words, in anti-racism and what became known as Islamophobia, but started off as Paki bashing and many other things. And indeed, when I first read Satanic Verses, I was, you know, I didn't even think it was a novel about what became called Islam. I mean, I knew that Muslims were involved, but that was about it. I thought it was a novel about migration, because if you remember, it begins with this extraordinary scene of these two Indian gentlemen in their own home ground falling to the earth and being transmogrified, transformed, turned into hybrid monsters by the very fact that they had landed on this new soil called England, the beaches of England. And in the plane with them, this plane that has exploded, are all these wives who are trying to reach their husbands in Britain, all these Indian wives who are being grilled, or in the discourse of the narrator, being grilled about, you know, the size of their husbands' penises, because that will actually identify them as true wives, or the numbers of children they've had. So in other words, a very, very distinct anti-state migration policies narrative, which very quickly became a different kind of narrative to those of us who had first read it as that. It became a narrative in which supposedly the people that it was actually trying to whose lives it was trying to go into and give imaginative life to, were the people who were saying, no, this is a work directed against us. There's a long politics involved in that moment. I mean, a politics that began in India, which was anti-Rushdie based, but anyhow, it ended up with the Satanic Verses being the target of a fatwa, Salman becoming the target of a fatwa, and the whole question of blasphemy growing large on the world stage in protests around the world. Now, this was very, very difficult for writers here, because writers were on both sides. They thought Salman was too big for his boots and should never have done that. They also thought, oh my God, this is terrible. This is, you know, free expression being attacked in the country where it is a fundamental part of our human rights apparatus.
That's great.
So that, you know,
I was just
that was one moment. Then you roll on, and I can roll on and roll on for you. But yeah, I mean, I don't know whether you want me to.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of pivot a little bit from there, because just there's so much you said in that history that kind of gives us a history of where rights and writing went. I mean, with Amnesty in the 70s, very much based in the Cold War moment, and then a moment where a different politics took place. And as you were talking, I was thinking about Milan Kundera. I was thinking of Flaubert. There's a great quote that Milan Kundera says. I mean, people don't think of Flaubert's Madame Bovary as being a human rights novel, right? But it was the first time, you know, in the 19th century novel, women started to do things that they didn't do in life. And the point I think Jacques Rancière makes is, you know, that Emma Bovary was allowed to move through life as if she had an inner life, and then under other literary hierarchies, she wouldn't be able to do that. And Kundera says what he loves about Flaubert is Flaubert gives us the right to be stupid in interesting ways, which I think is, you know, sums up a lot. But I was thinking, just as you're talking, and I'm going to ask Sri to come in here in a moment as well, of what happens when those kind of ideas actually start to travel. Because when Milan Kundera won the Jerusalem Book Prize in 1984, if you look at his speech, he goes to Jerusalem. This is 1984, so, you know, with civil war in Lebanon, in Jerusalem, and he says, he does this wonderful speech about literary freedom and the novel as a form of freedom, and then he says, this kind of novel can't exist in Europe anymore. Jerusalem is now the heart of the novel. And you think, oh, oh my God. And yes, and oh, there's another history. And then Jean Coetzee wins 2 years later, and he picks up on this and says, actually, you know, the novel as a point of freedom for liberty gets very complicated once, as you were saying, I think that's what beautifully came through about the Rushdie story, once it starts being a story about migration and transnationality, and then the sense of what rights might be in that question of writing suddenly becomes a much more complicated set of experiences and questions than that earlier moment of amnesty, free expression, and the Cold War had as it were led us to believe.
From the writer's
at this point. Sorry.
I was just going to say, from the writer's point of view, Lyndsey, the other thing that comes out of that moment, which is very crucial now, and of course has its own history as well, is the whole history of offence. And what does offence actually mean? Where does it start? Is there a right to be offended or to feel offended by literature? And what primacy does that have in terms of, you know, the writer's perhaps genuine attempt to put social justice in play in a fiction or indeed a poem? And so, you know, you end up with these, if you like, competing sensibilities, competing rights, and when things go global, you never know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'll stop talking.
No, it's fascinating. It's really, and also I hope we come back to that certain question of what literature is allowed to do with freedom of speech as compared to universities. I mean, we always have rules about freedom of speech. Each institution has rules about freedom of speech. In universities, we have freedom of speech, but it has to be well evidenced and well argued. You can't just go into a seminar and say anything you like. But fiction and art occupies somewhere else. Can I just pick up on that question about migration and globalism, and then what happens to rights, and bring Sunny into the conversation, if I may. Sunny, many writers claim to be cosmopolitan, but few writers, I think, can genuinely claim the multi-directionality of your career and work. India, Pakistan, Namibia, the US, Spain, Barcelona, the UK. One of the major criticisms of human rights is that it is too Western-centric and much too ready to humanize others, but blind to its own inhuman contradictions. How do you think literature and film has challenged that kind of Eurocentric, Anglocentric notion around rights and justice? And yet, where do you see us looking in terms of world literature to different conceptions of rights?
It's a big question. And first of all, I love the book. You already know this. I raced my way through it. I actually want to try a slightly different way of looking at history of rights and human rights and literature. And you're right. I want to start with the fact that I was a young teenager when I first found Rushdie. And of course, I was in India. I was in a small town. And this is before the Satanic Verses. So this is already with Midnight's Children. And of course, the whole issue around the Indira Gandhi and the politics of that in India had already begun. And I, at that point, as a young teenager, found Rushdie incredibly freeing. He took a language that was constantly drummed into our heads as we got it wrong, and he freed it. English was my language because of the way Rushdie treated it. He kicked it about, and I loved that. When I got to Satanic Verses, I read it and laughed my way through it because it was not a novel about migration for me. It was a novel that was steeped in Bollywood gossip. It was about people who were known to me through press, through other ideas. It was about ideas. It was about all these people I knew. But more than that, it was the wit, it was cunning, it was snide, it was snarky. And one of the things it was also about was the critique of power for me, and a direct aim at the Ayatollah. That wonderful image of the cleric from Paris who returns and then swallows up the people who blindly march into his mouth. And I always feel that that was never actually picked up in large enough numbers. And I think a large part of this links to your question about this kind of Western-centric idea of human rights, of liberty, of free speech, because we can't quite disconnect these from earlier histories and legacies of three basic things: slave trade, empire, and genocide. And these three things are interrelated. When the UN Charter of Human Rights comes through mid-century, much of the world is still not free. These legacies aren't, gotten rid of. My parents were born in a colony. So I think there is a kind of, there has always been a massive divide between the ways in which the global North sees the ideas of human rights that they have access to. There was a kind of, during the Cold War, there was a kind of smugness. There was a moral authority that went with it. And I think that wasn't available to people in the global South. When I was a kid, it was still the third world. We didn't have those access. And it wasn't just about our access, that our regimes were corrupt, our regimes were oppressing us, but the fact that many of these regimes were fully backed by Western democratic powers. The parts that you missed out, my trajectory through the globe also goes through Latin America, Chile, for a starter. So I think there's a problem that happens when we get to, yes, it's a watershed moment in many ways, but I think what is often missed out is that there is a loss of moral authority, but that loss of moral authority goes hand in hand through the 1990s and the last 2 decades of the 21st century with a loss of economic power and geopolitical power. So the West can no longer protect itself from the kinds of depredations it was quite happy to either support, overlook, or at least tolerate in order to continue its little bubble. So when we get to human rights, then I think they are hugely contested, but they've always been contested. This is, are we really going to go back? And we could start with Afro-Ben. This wasn't a kind of a straightforward process. I think what has happened is there are a lot of writers who are challenging the ways in which the global North has centered itself as a moral authority. The margins are speaking back. Often the margins have kind of moved to the center, which I think upsets a lot of people. I think there's a much more nuanced, complex debate that needs to happen about in the UK, and more so in the UK than the US, because I feel that debate is happening more in the US than here, where what happens with a kind of structural exclusion and marginalization. We're very quick to talk about writers and our freedom to speak and our freedom to write, our freedom to create, but we are, and as long as there are structural exclusions built into publishing industry, into academia, into the literary world, these freedoms are more or less a version of the bubble we've spoken about in terms of rights. So as a writer, I look at it as a novelist. I don't write about human rights. That's not what I try to do. My commitment as a novelist is to think about how we can change the injustices. And that is not because I chose that. It comes from being born in a former colony. It comes from being born a woman and not particularly even the center of that state and that civilization. And of course, it adds on. My concern, it goes back to Baldwin. If we can change the way people look at the world, we can then potentially start changing the world. So for me, as a writer, that's what I'm interested in. Does that sometimes fit the rubric put together by ideas of human rights? Potentially. Does it go beyond it? Yes. Where am I looking for inspiration? I'm sorry, but I'm looking at the global South. I'm looking for the major conversations are happening elsewhere. They're happening amongst Black and brown writers here in US and in UK and the global North. They're happening in the global South, both in terms of laws that are being formulated and imagined. 2018 377 judgment is a great case. And the idea and the concept of bodily sovereignty, which may be very, very important going forward. But also, you know, how do we then look at a world where our DNA is part of our human rights? Access, you know, who gets data sharing of our DNA? You know, all of those things. And that's where bodily sovereignty becomes crucial for someone like me. How do I bring it into my work? At the moment, I'm not sure, but I'm working on it. But I think for me, all this, the developments, the interesting parts are happening elsewhere rather than Europe, Western Europe and North America.
That's terrific. I mean, there's so much you brought up there, but three things I just want to pull out so we can have them on the board and come back to them. And one is, what foundational stories do we tell about human rights? And for a long time, it's always been after the war, European and American human rights. So that kind of foundational story, it begins with the UN, but it is, I had a conversation with Itamar Mann a few weeks ago. It could easily be the transatlantic slave trade. It could easily be different foundational stories, and the way we tell that story, and that needs to happen, and it needs to happen now. The other thing I think you make very clear about, you know, when we're talking about writing, what are we talking about? Is it just writers and publishers and access? Or those structures themselves are heavily invested in power and privilege. You know, and quite often when we talk about the teaching of literature, it's like, well, why are we just teaching novels? Literature is everywhere, writing is everywhere. You know, like you know, with Grenfell, in the first council meeting, one of the first things that happens in that council meeting, someone reads a poem. Yeah. So that question of where we think literature and writing is in order to reframe those questions is another sense. And also your last point, which is absolutely right about bodily sovereignty. What happens if we don't just look at rights in terms of one trauma, one genocide, one moment, but again, or just one nation? You know, the whole question about human rights, as the lawyers will tell us, is always dogged by national sovereignty and what you can get countries to do. What if we start talking rather about human rights, actually about bodily sovereignty, which is the next challenge? I might bring Tom in on that point, partly because of the different kind of histories that we use in order to tell human rights stories. I wonder if you've got anything to say about that, but also what are we doing when we're talking about human rights? I mean, one of the things I love about your work is the way you're a close reader, but you bring that attention to the work of human rights, and you make lots of interesting ideas, comments about what human rights talk itself does in these kind of complex histories and complex geopolitical conflicts.
Thanks, Lyndsey. First of all, it's an excellent and fabulous book, and everyone should buy it and read it. That would be my first answer to this question. Because these questions that you just posed are, I think, fundamentally the questions of your book. What kind of language, and particularly what kind of literary language is human rights talk? I think actually you give, and I would, I'm just going to endorse this, repeat it and endorse it. I think your answer is that it's not just one language, that there are multiple languages, styles, rhetorics in which the idea of human rights gets announced and propelled. And they're extremely different, and they can have extremely different consequences. In my little diagram of your book, you give us three answers, and you're interested in the tension between those three answers. One kind of language that human rights is, or human rights talk is a very confident, morally confident, and powerfully confident assertion of alleged matters of fact, that just such and such is the case. There are these things called human rights announced by laws and conventions and so on. And we have the speakers of that language have the capacity and the privilege simply to take it for granted, mostly for themselves and not for others. Then you offer a second version of this, I think, which is kind of where a lot of your critical animus is. And that is human rights understood as pleading, as sometimes you associate it with the claims about empathy. It often gets castigated as liberal humanitarianism, but it's about regretting, it's about pity, and it's about pleading. So the pleader asks for the sympathy of the more powerful. And that's, so there, I mean, that's farther away, that's far away from the taken for grantedness rhetoric of the simple statement. But for you, it's not far enough. And in fact, I think you're investigating some scary complicities between the language of empathy and the language of fact. Fact in this sense, not the facts that you're so interested in Virginia Woolf. That's a different notion of fact, I think. Matter of fact, I would say here. But then there's a third kind of language. And this one you endorse, which is thinking of human rights as a matter of claiming. So not of stating and not of pleading, but of claiming. And the claim is oftentimes a radical one. It's a demand for recognition, but not just for recognition, also for redistribution, for a transformation in the way the world is structured, for the appearance of new actors and new figures on the stage of history. So I think these three languages correspond to three different, I don't know exactly what the right word is, ideologies or versions of human rights. And I think the book is amazing at producing tensions between them and not allowing some big notion, allegedly capacious notion of human rights to blur these differences. So there's a language of human rights, there's a sovereign language of human rights. There's a liberal language. So the sovereign language, you know, is used to justify the actions of sovereigns primarily in the world. There's a liberal one, which is not entirely comfortable with the actions of the sovereigns and often thinks, sometimes correctly and sometimes incorrectly, that it is a counter to them. That it's a reform or can provide some redress for the violence of sovereignty. But it generally takes the form of requests for inclusion, right? Let us in, where the in is not itself stigmatized or criticized. So there's a liberal language of inclusion. And then there's what you love, which is the insurgent language of human rights, which takes on both the sovereign and the liberal rhetoric. That you use these formulas frequently in the book. You'll be describing a scene. In fact, it's very notable in your Grenfell chapter, which I think is incredible. Where precisely when you're talking about the person who reads the Persian poem, you begin the hearing, the witness who reads that poem. You say that it's not a plea for her recognition, it's a demand or a claim to remake the political community not just to accept her into the community, but to remake the political community in a different way. So that for you is the insurgent moment where the structure of the space of politics is challenged and potentially transformed by the invocation of this language of rights. So I don't know whether we're posing questions back to the author or whether we're allowed to, but I'm gonna exercise that right here and ask. I found myself really interested in potential. So the blur between the sovereign discourse and the liberal discourse seems possible, and as I said, scary. And I think you're really good at noticing when it happens. But I'm wondering if sometimes there's a blur between the liberal and the insurgent position here, and I'm not sure. My only like little tiny critique on the edge here is that I think there is. So I'll just put my cards on the table. I think there is, and that it needs to be somehow respected and understood. So I found myself thinking again and again. It's one of my favorite examples, so it's not unusual that I would be thinking about it. But you bring it up. If we're talking, for instance, about starting the history of human rights activism or advocacy or language with the campaign to abolish the slave trade and ultimately to outlaw slavery. If you remember, I know, the famous medallion of Josiah Wedgwood, which shows a scene of pleading. There's no question, a scene of superiority and inferiority, a scene of class and race difference, spatialized and visualized. And the slogan on the medallion is, "Am I not a man and a brother?" ? So that seems to me is right on the border between pleading, between accepting, if only in order to change it, the asymmetry between the speaker and the hearer who has the capacity to grant the request, but also a terribly disruptive statement. If the answer, so it's interesting because it asks for an answer. It's not just a claim, it's a claim in the form of a question, which puts the burden of responsibility on the hearer, the guy in the medallion, and the audience, the public opinion. So it's a question which, if answered yes, means that the asymmetry will have to be challenged, and that the status of the responder becomes more fragile, becomes less, we can't take it for granted in the same way. Because if the answer is yes, and the pleader is indeed a man and a brother, and we'll set aside the gendered language for the moment, if indeed that's right, then the guy who says yes is not the same guy he used to be before he had to answer the question. Right? And the space that they share is transformed if the questioner is indeed an equal of whatever sort to the answerer. But there, the radical claim could easily be confused with a polite request for inclusion. So I'm wondering how you think about that. So yes, multiple languages of human rights, but maybe sometimes not so easily distinguished from each other in interesting ways.
This is the lesson I failed to learn, is never publish anything without giving it to Tom first to explain to you what it is that you've done. But I absolutely agree with that space between the insurgent and the context of universalism and liberalism and transnationalism that might make that insurgency genuinely transformative. We need desperately to find a way of articulating it. And as you were talking, I was reminding of something that you wrote, Tom, which is that human rights talk is often, you know, the most special kind of special pleading you ever get. But what human rights talk has to do is claim your case, which is that's the specificity, that's the moment of insurgence, but to do it on behalf of a wider notion of humanity at the same time. And every kind of, you could kind of do a taxonomy of human rights talk throughout history. And the way when it works, and that's why the Wedgwood example is perfect, but there are lots of others, it's because it hits that sweet spot. It seems to me we're in quite a complicated zone for making those sweet spots hittable. And just to follow on that, I'm going to throw another question back at you. I think part of the reason why we're in a complicated zone for thinking about that alliance, and it does go back to Grenfell, but it also goes back to an awful lot of other things and touches on some things that Singh was saying, is how do we recognize impunities as human rights crimes? What evidence do we need? And I think a lot of the way that when liberalism becomes ineffectual, it is when it's not recognizing crimes. It's not because it's being evil or nasty or smug. It's, you know, I mean, Grenfell is a case in point. Yeah. This is, to me, I would say this is a crime against humanity, has happened here, that will only be solved. You know, will only be, you know, it has to go to the Old Bailey. It has to have some kind of moment in court. But to see what this crime is, how this crime has happened, which is around thoughtlessness, which is around banality, which is now around corruption, which is around plutocracy, is very difficult to get recognized. And I think one of the other interesting developments in human rights and humanities work is that question of how do we evidence what we're doing to each other? And this is, you know, this goes back, you know, again to the slave trade, people recognizing slave trade as a crime that is still living. But it also goes back to other things, which is how do you document a crime? And if you think about, you know, the trouble that we had documenting genocide over time. Can you just quickly, because I'm aware of the time, I want to Singh, we should have scheduled this for longer, say a bit about that relationship between evidence and identifying crimes against humanity.
Well,
yes.
I'm not sure how I've been pulled into it, but I thought Thomas's point was really interesting, and I think it's one that I constantly struggle with, because in many ways, you know, structurally, I'm positioned constantly in the space of the pleader, and I think this is important because, which is why I talk about sovereignties and bodily sovereignty and imaginative sovereignties, because I think we should not be talking about human rights, and we have been, in this very kind of legalistic, but also really kind of narrow way. So something terrible happens. There's a genocide. There's something like, you know, something that can be pinned. Often that happens over there. And then the over there need to plead. And I've always wondered about the Wedgwood medallion, partly because who's made it? Who's doing the pleading? And I think that to me has always sat really uncomfortably, because very rarely is the plea from those bearing the brunt. There is always, I think, and this is why for me, the insurgent position and the liberal position are not necessarily overlapping. I think insurgency can sometimes tap into some of the liberal allyship or advantages or resources. But at the end, I think the issue with the liberal position is that it positions itself as a mediating position. It positions itself as the middleman. You know, we shall translate for the world. I think it's quite interesting to think about when we started with thinking about Rushdie's Satanic Verses, of that mediating position that he assumes, because of course intersectionally he's walking all these strange, complicated lines, and in some ways the people who got angry and upset and offended constructed him and his work and his position as that of a liberal one, as in somehow speaking for, rather than necessarily claiming. And I think it's all of these complicated things that need to be discussed. We need to kind of say who is pleading, who is claiming, and where are these boundaries? Because I think they're always going to be in fluid, they're always going to be in flux, but I think there's got to be some way of noticing. I mean, the classic social media line, check your privilege. I think somewhere we all have to sort of stop and say, am I taking that liberal position? I mean, I know for myself, I'm constantly sort of going, maybe I need to pass this on to someone else who needs to talk about it, because it's really not my space. But I think we all perhaps need to do that far more, in some ways to expand that insurgent space on multiple intersections, rather than kind of consistently falling into quite comfortable liberal positions. And I think as a writer and academic, I do feel that, it's kind of a sweet spot for me individually. But I also see the kind of dangers and the problems and potential harms that come out of me occupying that space.
But it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, as you were talking, I was reminded of a very difficult conversation just after Grenfell. And I was at a meeting, and the activist Shaista Aziz, who might be here tonight, was there with me. And there was a poet who was with us, and she was explaining how she was going to Grenfell in order to take photographs so she could write poems. And this was about 2 weeks after. And Shaista and I were both quite horrified by this, partly because of the intrusion, but also as I try to explain actually I do say in the book, this is not everyone's grief. You don't get to be complicit with the conditions that create something like Grenfell and then walk in and say, I'm going to write a poem about it, right? I mean, this is not an okay position, one. But also, and it was trying to say, actually, there's something that is not universalizable, because the conditions that created the tragedy were, as Arendt would say, an attack on diversity. So you don't get to have your universal back at that moment. The other more pragmatic thing was like, do you think there aren't any poets in North London? Have you been? I mean, it's like, there's a lot of writing and a lot of work and creative work going on. But it doesn't need to be bought anywhere. It's already there. It's just a question of, as you said, Sunny, of like shutting up and moving over and creating space. That's your gift. And doing something else with that space. But then, just to bring Lisa back here, I also think there's the kind of the reason that literature and art can get into human rights crevices, so to speak, is because it taps into the moral imagination in a kind of way that it is very difficult to live psychically in an unjust world. And Lisa, and you've written so much about the psyche in this context. So these spaces that literature can twist and turn, I think, do without the kind of empathy model, the sentimentality model, the liberalism you were talking about, Sunny, that crashes in, does open up the intolerability of living in a context. Climate emergency would be another one, but in this current context. Lisa.
There's so much to say that I found myself completely tongue-tied. There's so many positions that are absolutely just, but I think from I don't know if it's my point of view, but thinking about what I read and what people write, there's a way in which I think at the heart of a lot of good writing, whatever good is, from wherever it is in the world, there's a kind of a search for social justice. Let's forget the word human rights, because that's so loaded now, and it's been so overlaid with history of the present in so many ways. So let's just put it to one side for one moment. I think at the heart of a great deal of writing, whether it's the witnessing kind of writing or indeed it's the insurgent moment, there is this search for social justice. or search for justice. I mean, it's there in Job, even though there's an angry God standing over it. What you remember of that story is the suffering man who's suffering from unjust ills. And you see it, you know, throughout literature in various ways. And I would say that what literature does, or what writing tries to do, to go back again to this other than human rights language, is to hold out a hope wherever it comes from. There is a kind of a hope enshrined in it when it's at its best. And that hope is for a world that we can't probably describe. So psychic, what do we mean when we talk about psychic struggles? We mean complexity. You know, everybody comes into the world as a dependent. We're all born as babies. And as children, we always have people around us who are far bigger than us and who quite often feel to the child as if they're committing injustices, as if their little children's, little babies, whatever human rights, their ability to live is being contested in some way. And there's a struggle going on. And I think what writing does for us is it always also includes that moment of the shaping of the human, which is that moment of dependency and struggle and attempt to find some kind of fairness in the world, whether it's to do, with a history of horrible injustices, colonialism, whatever it happens to be. There is that position within it when it's at its best, and that's why I think it's worth championing. I mean, I think it's worth leaving a space for it to be there, to allow it to bring into being for us all that complexity of life.
Thanks, Lisa. Can I just leave before we throw open to general questions, and I hand back to David, just a last question to Sunny, just on that point, because you teach creative writing within a social justice context at my alma mater, which I'm fiercely proud of. What are students doing with that question of writing and social justice? If you just to give us a glimpse of.
Well, I think you probably know. Our demographics of students haven't changed that much. It's still very much North London, often non-traditional student body. They're extraordinary in the kinds of life experiences and ideas they bring. But of course, they also bring the experience and a deep understanding at a kind of molecular, cellular level of injustices and exclusions and marginalizations that they have experienced, both individually and transgenerationally. So I think it's in many ways it's the right place to teach. I mean, I love teaching there. I can't imagine teaching anywhere else because it's ideal. And we always kind of, I mean, I don't think we use the language of human rights as much as we do the language of ethics and the idea of ethical engagement at all levels, ethical engagement with our craft and our art at all levels. And I think that tends to work better because we make explicit ideas of, writing character. This is not about writing somebody else who's not like you because you just felt like it. Questions of should you write? I mean, I think that's more than a question of is it free speech and you have the right to write. Do not get me wrong. By all means, write what you want. But can you do it well? Are you willing to do the hard work? But also, should you write this? Is it someone else's story to tell? And it kind of goes back to the idea of just shutting up and passing the mic. And I think, I always go back to, and I want to link it back, this idea of ethics to, and this conversation of writing human rights. Many years ago, I had a kind of a casual conversation with a lawyer about the European Charter of Human Rights, which we are not going to be part of and covered by the end of this month. And he said something that I've always held on to, and I think it was the best definition of human rights. And he was talking specifically about the Charter, but it was the best definition I've ever found. And he said, it's to protect us from the worst of ourselves. And I always go back to it. I was like, well, and in some ways it's like, okay, how do we protect ourselves? And that is at the end an ethical question. So whether I look at teaching or I look at my own craft, at the end of it is that basic, am I harming people? Maybe I should just pass the mic. Sometimes it's as simple as that.
Well, on that point of passing the mic, I'm going to pass over to David, but I also just want to say that even though we're going to be we're going to lose quite a lot of European protections, the fight for the European Convention and the Human Rights Act is still on, and we haven't lost that fight yet. And a lot of us are still in for it. So, and I think you're absolutely right. It's like, as Salil Shetty says, we need human rights because the powerful screw the powerless. That's the bottom line. Yeah. David, can I pass back to you now?
Thank you so much. It's such a rich and provocative conversation. I did forget to mention something slightly crucial at the start, which is don't use the chat function. Please use the Q&A tab if you'd like to pose your questions. I did say hold back and let them simmer, but now while I'm wrapping up, please do fire away, and then we'll make our way through them. As I mentioned at the start, I won't systematically draw together the threads of everyone's comments together. That would be impossible anyway, and I still less do I want to take up much time. But I do just want to, I suppose, return to one of the central concerns, Lyndsey, that you mentioned when introducing the book about the adequacy of compassion, which has come up in the conversation, I think, and empathy in literary humanitarianism, and by extension, the effective role of reading in facilitating new kinds of solidarities or ways of imagining social justice or hope, as Lisa put it. And this put me in mind of a question that drives your argument early on, namely, and I'm quoting you here, what if we learn to do human rights again by following our writers into the darkest places of our history? And I suppose the corollary question for me is how, by following writers on that journey, can we redress the apparent ineffectuality of our own critical compassion for the escalating plight of the powerless? And I've been thinking a lot about this recently, and thinking about the force of what we do as academics, the force of academic criticism. I mean, why this question is hardly new. I think that the sentimental logic at its heart has been very much in the air this year. We will be judged by our capacity for compassion, declared Rishi Sunak in late March when he announced his furlough scheme. And his use of the future tense, I think, carried the piety of moral self-certainty, allowing him to elevate his sentiment beyond critique. Yet this solemnly enunciated call for compassion came just days after the release of the final damning report on the Home Office's handling of the Windrush scandal, which recorded institutional failures to understand racism. Not to be overshadowed by this, Sunak's brand of financial care was made to appear like a Treasury twin for the so-called kindness epidemic that, according to some commentators, had seen neighbourly concerns sweeping across lockdown Britain. But as Lyndsey would say, indeed does say, interpersonal feelings like compassion alone are not enough, because history teaches that it never have been. As she shrewdly notes toward the beginning of Writing and Writing, the correlation of progressive feelings and progressive change is often not quite the causality it first appears. And I think that's something we've been sort of touching on in some ways throughout the discussion. Contra Sunak, her book insists that we won't, in fact, be judged by our compassion, we'll be judged by our action. And in this respect, I think Lyndsey is unafraid to challenge some settled assumptions about literary humanitarianism, as we've heard tonight, and about the virtues of reading narratives of suffering and injustice. And to give a snapshot of that challenge, I want to quote just a few lines from her preface, for there she tackles up front the tricky role of interpersonal feeling in our current critical moment, when we can neither assume that our research has any political efficacy, nor sanctimoniously view those readers who value fiction for the way it models ethnocultural empathy as automatically misguided, naive, or simply acquiescent. What's more, I think we can also forget, and Lisa will have views on this, we also forget, as Zadie Smith has recently observed, what writers are, since they themselves are people with Mrs. Smith with a great deal of inappropriate curiosity about the lives of others, which gets us back, I think, to Sunny's point about whether writers need to bear in mind the ethical problematic of doing harm when they're writing about the lives of others. Fiction, says Smith, has compassion and empathy in its DNA. Now, Lyndsey might agree, but I think she also reminds us that we can't take the benefits of literature's emotive traction for granted. Human rights, she asserts in her preface, belong to the big scripts of collective endeavour, among them the books, thinkers, revolutionaries, artists, activists, and survivors who wanted not just more compassionate feeling in the world, but change, real change. somewhere along the lines, as Lyndsey, we stopped thinking about creative writing as part of this tradition. A more modest literary humanitarianism crept into our discussions. As for the readers of the 18th century sentimental novel, so for us, books make us feel better. Feeling better, of course, might also mean feeling more thoughtfully, more attuned to gross inequality and the multiple moral ironies of feeling so bad about powerlessness whilst keeping so much power, for example. But it may not. Now, someone who's writing a book, but partly reassessing the politics of sentimentalism in refugee writing, I sort of felt like a pang of self-consciousness when reading those lines. But that's, sensation is kind of par for the course when you're engaging with what I would call Lyndsey's dialogical style of criticism, which is always asking you to reflect harder on the rapport we imagine literature creates between political responsibility and intellectual commitment, between practical justice and scholarly judgment. She compels us to answer tough questions, I think, of ourselves, our disciplines, and of the assumptions we make about how the work of reading might inform the work of real-world transformation. And precisely by doing that, Lyndsey doesn't afford us the luxury of giving up on the idea that literary inquiry might be consequential beyond the realms of its own institutional circulation. Then it might help us to expand, in Sunny's word, that insurgent space. So in defiance of a kind of bulbous monograph, what Lyndsey has in this very spry, uncompromising book managed to contribute precisely one of those scripts, those big scripts of collective endeavor, to recall her phrase. And I want to now allow you all to engage with that script a little more, and I want to open it up to the audience Q&A. We've already got several questions coming in, and I will do my very best to field them right now, starting at the top. This one's from Syed, who's 15 years old and writing a fiction novel, The Parallel Earth, which describes that even if everything is reversed, we will actually live in a better world. Syed says, I'm from Pakistan and my parents fully support me, but I'm losing my motivation to complete it, considering that it might be too sensitive. And also I'm extremely careful about these things and never hurt anyone's feelings, religion, color, or caste, or anything. I need some advice on how I can find the motivation to complete my novel.
I just say, Saeed, go for it.
Yeah.
Go for it. I think every novelist has that moment of going, oh no, I can't complete it. Novel writing is really boring. It's lonely. It takes you away. You could be doing far more interesting things, reading more wonderful books. It's boring. Just keep at it. Keep at it.
I would also say, in my experience, that if you're feeling like that, you're almost finished, perhaps. It might well be the case that you're getting near an ending of sorts.
Just one more before we move on, Saeed. Speaking as an older woman, don't be afraid of hurting people's feelings. It's the worst inhibition. It took me 55 years to learn that lesson. So just do it.
Yeah. Well, I hope that's incentivizing enough. Brilliant. The next question is from Pramila. What is your position regarding cultural appropriation? It's an interesting question because the Zadie Smith essay I quoted was all very much about cultural appropriation, which is a term that she herself loathes, I think. Do you feel you cannot write on behalf of another, even if you have done a lot of research on this other, and you feel compelled to speak right?
Because I touch on that in the book, maybe ill-advisedly. Some of you will remember the moment when Lionel Shriver raised this very question, which is an important question, but raised it whilst wearing a sombrero. And I think I want to say two things. One is the history, and I want to see what the other says. Well, the history of writing and intellectual property and imagination is not a neutral history. Okay, it comes with power. And after Lionel Shriver gave her talk, I think it was in Melbourne, wearing a sombrero, Claudia Rankin was asked what she thought about this particular thing. And she said, why does it always have to be my right? My right to appropriate, my right to have, my right to imagine. So on the one hand, I want to say this history of rights, imaginative rights, is a history with consequences. But on the other hand, I want to say, well, come on, grow up, listen to your agent. Writers can write about whatever their market will take. This is a kind of bogus kind of question. On the one hand, I'm absolutely with Zadie Smith on this. Writers are always interested in otherness. They will not stop writing about other people. but also it's a kind of false, yet another kind of faux, the kind of libertarian bogey of I'm not allowed to write about I think what I want anymore. And I think, come on, if your market will take it, you can. If you're good enough, you can. If you're not, why are you telling us that you're worried about it? Just get on and do your stuff.
And I want to add to that. I mean, I think racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, Islamophobic writing, all of these kinds of anti-Semitic writing, these are failures of craft. And so I want to actually take it back and say, first of all, why do you want to write this? What's your emotional, psychological, personal investment in it? What's the risk you are taking by writing this wonderful other? Tell me. I mean, and really just that's a simple starting point. And when I say, let's think about it ethically, nobody's asking, oh, please, you should not write, or you cannot write. Let me rephrase that. Maybe you should not write, but nobody's stopped Lionel Shriver from writing and publishing and holding a massively well-paid column. So this is a bogey. This is a straw man argument. I think, like Lyndsey says, it's about power. Who gets to tell whose story? And frankly, I think as writers, we have a responsibility to acknowledge that the moment we start writing and the moment we start publishing, that places us in an extraordinarily privileged spot. So there is nothing wrong with exercising power and privilege with a little bit of ethical responsibility.
I would just add to that and say cultural appropriation is a term we like to use now. I think it's something that you don't want to practice in life, but as a writer, if you do it well, you can do anything. I mean, Flaubert wrote Madame Bovary. Nobody said you can't write as a woman. He did. And we still talk about it and we still interpret it. There's nothing wrong with it if you do it well. And it's not that, it's just a use of imagination. And what you do in life may be different.
Thanks all. We now have a question from Peter Boxall from Sussex. Hello, Peter. Thanks for such engaging discussion. He says, my question, are there rights and writings that are not human? If so, are human rights and writings partly shaped by them?
Thanks, Peter.
Typical, idiomatically Boxillian.
I think Peter has written a very good book called The Prosthetic Imagination, which touches these issues. I think Sally started to talk about that when she was talking about AI, and also I would, I can't answer this question because I haven't done the work, but the work that's being done around the climate emergency and what a life is and what it might mean for certain categories of life to have rights is evolving. Maybe not fast enough to save the planet, but is certainly enough to sort of make us think again about what it is that's attached to rights. And of course, legally, it's not just humans who have rights, corporations can have them.
Well, actually funny because our program works with one of the key strands is around sustainability and the Anthropocene extinction. And one of the areas that we look at very closely is precisely around not just rights, but also solidarities with non-human people, to use that wonderful, wonderful phrase. And I shall let everyone look it up. Because I don't think human rights, for me, human rights are and should be an ever expanding sphere. This isn't sort of us deciding, okay, we now tick those boxes and we're done. We should be actively expanding them. And if that goes to non-human people, well, I'm quite okay with it.
Thank you. I have a question for Natasha, from Natasha Ramundu, who rephrases her question further down, which I'm going to take the rephrased question. She says, what compels an academic researcher to explore writing and rights? And she also says the book is excellent.
Thank you.
Motivation and compulsion.
Gosh, that's an interesting question. I think it does go back to being in a very, very privileged position that when I went into academia, I always kind of thought it was a way of doing politics and activism and getting paid for it, as well as doing the scholarship. So I think, and this does go, I was thinking about the people I'd invited, and it does go back to hi, Lisa, why I'm so attracted to Singh and her work. And Tom is a moment in the 80s and 90s where questions of art and writing were discussed with political questions, and you kind of thought you were doing both at the same time. And with the professionalization of academia and the subject silos we were put in because of all sorts of institutional pressures, and the requirement that university courses do different things, we in the UK, I think it's much better in the US, but in the UK, we kind of lost some of that. So I just think I've been doing what I've always been doing, because I was fortunate enough to be in a context, in an intellectual and political context, in which that was what we did. It was, you know, it was a way of, you know, I think also I'd say to my students, I mean, people who are reading because they want to find out how to live some kind of life, not necessarily a good life, but some kind of life. And when you're here, so part of my problem with the kind of empathy argument you heard a lot in COVID, where book sales just went off the road. Everyone started reading, you know, book sales are major at the moment. People say, well, they're reading to escape, they're reading for solace. No, they're not. They're reading to work out what's going on. That's why people read. I think, you know, we read privately, but it's a profoundly existential and collective act, because we're trying to work out what we're supposed to be doing here. And most quiet children who read a lot, who became noisy children who claimed a lot, come from that kind of momentum. I think our students still do. I don't know, Tom, does that?
Does Tom want to, yeah, did you want to respond to that, Tom, as well? That question.
I think Tom's the only other person who's got kind of a professorship in humanities and human rights, so this is why I'm pulling.
Yeah, I'm still back at that moment when it was, you know, we were allowed to have our cake and eat it too, and someone paid you to think about these kind of questions. The other thing I'd say is it tells you, I think maybe it's a little bit distinctive about human rights, and not more broadly about engagement in the world, that human rights it's a language of activism and of protest and so on, as we were saying, but it's also a body of knowledge. It's a you know, you need to think theoretically, you need to speak philosophically about it, because you can't take either the term human or the term rights for granted at the beginning. So it's always going to have or it ought to, I think, have an intellectual or an academic dimension. For all these, I mean, both because it's interesting and for all these reasons that we've been talking about tonight, which is that it's criticizable. And if it's just a language of engagement, then it gets off scot-free. So it needs some academics in there to produce that critical account of it.
I think it's certainly with teaching human rights, because if you teach the long history of human rights and students read different histories of rights, and say, well, it's not all just the nice guys. You say, no, like, you know, this is a very complicated history. And then, you know, why do I love Burke so much? And he hated that. So it is that kind of a discourse that moves between the universal, the liberal, and the insurgent, and the conservative. And that's great for students because it really sort of tests them out. But also it's kind of interesting politically, or sometimes you'll find yourself, if you're doing rights talk, in the most unusual company. And I think, you know, you used to think, why am I agreeing with David Davis? But he's quite good. All right, or, you know, certain rule of law moments. And that, I think, is really positive in terms of hanging on to a politics of dissensus. Rights allows us to do that without liberal compromise. You can actually have fights, but it does give us a language where you can push those fights out into the open. And so in some ways, rights talk is like literature talk. We think we're doing something, and we're doing something else at the same time when we're talking about either human rights or books.
I was just going to add a little footnote to that, Lyndsey. There's this extraordinary moment in around 2005 when we were at Penn. We were trying to get an amendment to the criminalization of so-called religious hatred bill, and, because it would have meant that nobody could even write in the loosest way about religion without some kind of suit coming to courts. And these were the competing rights of religion and free expression going on. And what was interesting about that is that, you know, you ended up being on the same side as, say, the Christian Union, who didn't want religion to be, the criticism of religion to be criminalized, because they wanted to criticize it. And so you ended up with very, very strange bedfellows.
Thanks all. Can I move to a question from Simon Porter? Grenfell was a crime against humanity. What are the other ongoing crimes? Is the treatment of disabled people and those with lived experience of mental health issues such a crime?
I think we're going to see that a lot in the fallout from COVID. I mean, the cases that came up this week, which I remember when it happened, where blanket do not resuscitate rulings were made on older people, which I thought at the time, thought, oh my God, this is another one of those crimes that it is a crime, but people would have thought panic. They would have thought, you know, it's okay to do it. But my God, you know, you put out a blanket do not resuscitate on a whole care home, on all your patients over 80, are you kidding me? And Amnesty, I think, have been involved in that. So I think, you know, I mean, certainly with COVID, there was never a kind of one-see moment where ministers looked out onto the lake and said, we'll just have to let the old people go. I mean, that didn't happen. But what did happen, I always think this is why Arendt's very helpful to think about the banality of evil, is that decisions were half taken or taken, well, people say extremists, but actually they were just thinking administratively, or they just weren't thinking, that are in those exactly those categories. And we're not just talking about crimes against vulnerable people, although your examples are absolutely right, but it is that way in which structures are set in place which enable those kind of crimes in my book to take place. But also, and increasingly, and that's why I think the discussion of neoliberalism is important, and corruption is important, and plutocracy is important, is that, sorry, my husband's just waving a bottle of wine at me. Need to be kind of thought back together. So that was the question I was trying to get to with Tom, is like, how do we recognize crimes in that way? On the one hand, we've got structures which are almost set up in which no one can be prosecuted because no one's guilty. And this is what we're going to see increasingly again and again and again. And it's a real kind of challenge, I think, particularly for human rights lawyers, to work within those terms, to make those things visible, to make them prosecutable, to make them shine as the crimes they are.
Me being scrupulous about my self-muting. Conscious of time, so I'm going to move on to Paul Emerson's question. I don't recall hearing the word authentic this evening, and it seems crucial in our definition of human rights. An authentic identity, an authentic voice, an authentic freedom. Please would the speakers react to the word authentic in relation to the issues they've been discussing.
If I never hear that word again, it'll be too soon. I can't stand it. I loathe it with a passion. And this comes from multiple places, but yes, it comes from my position as a woman of color, a migrant from a former colony. And I am so bloody sick of hearing people want to talk about authentic voices, because what is authentic is not actually what is created and spoken and experienced. What is authentic is a simulacrum of something that those in power with the ability to create narratives, to impose policy, to impose and maintain structures of injustice and inequality deem authentic. So if I never hear the word again, I'll be very happy.
No,
I'll sign that petition too.
I just got a message here from Sarah Churchill who says Tom Keenan is the professor who taught me to criticize authenticity. I'm with Walter Benjamin on authenticity. I do think it's gone, it's lost, but I love it when it catches me in the street or in a look, a glass of wine, a taste, a shop window. So I'll take my authenticity when it comes at me when I'm least expecting it, and knowing that it's a transitory, long lost moment.
Right. Okay, I shall move on to David Owen's question. In his little book on dignity, Michael Rosen draws a distinction between respect as observance. There's a typo. I don't break your rights, or I don't breach your rights. I think it says I don't breach your rights. Respect as observance, and respect as respectfulness, an attitude towards you. And this points to the fact that the decline of the latter undermines the efficiency of the former. Is this distinction helpful in drawing out the sense that ideally human rights aren't just right, but part of a mode of relationship to one another? So the distinction, to remind you again, the distinction between respect as observance, don't breach your right, and respect as respectfulness, an attitude towards you. Is that distinction at all useful, or?
It's terribly useful, terribly brilliant question, David. Thank you, but I haven't got the brain power left to argue it, apart from to say, to go back to, and maybe I'm going to take this opportunity to start concluding as well, to go back to something Tom was saying about claims and the relationality of rights, which I categorically do not mean that rights are relative, but the kind of respect that I think you're putting on the table here kind of requires that competing claims are met and worked over again and again and again with that kind of ethical requirement or moral requirement for joint respect. But I'm well aware that I'm not answering the question in any thoughtful enough detail. Another conversation.
I'm conscious of time. Would anyone like to elaborate on that question, or shall we begin to wrap up?
I would just say that Lyndsey's book is a completely, I don't know what the right word is, relationalist theory of human rights. It takes a big step away from a classic individualist persuasion here, and asks about rights that are negotiated, that are about others, that are constructed as the fabric of living together. So the end point of the question seems exactly the starting point of the book here.
Thank you, Tom. I think on that note, like we'd better draw
David,
things to conclusion.
very quickly, reminding yes to everything. So that Lyndsey, I think everybody who's involved with art in any way or form should be reading this book. I know that I plan to put it on our syllabus because it's really absolutely crucial. And if anyone's writing or creating any form of art, really do please go read this book.
Thank you, Singh. That's kind of what I was going to say. Exactly.
Oh.
Please go and read this book as a way of wrapping up. That it is incredibly engaging, and it's mercifully brisk as well, in a way that most monographs simply aren't, and beautifully written. And the footnotes are themselves a whole other kind of gateway to additional energizing reading that could not be more urgent for our current cultural moment. So thank you all, and thank you everyone for coming tonight. Lyndsey, do you want to offer some closing remarks?
No, I'm just thrilled with the quality and engagement of the conversation. And so sorry that we couldn't answer more of your Q&As, and that maybe puts me in mind that we need to think more seriously about providing platforms where we can publicly debate and learn from each other over these issues. So, and also to say, I mean, you know, it's late, it's dark. We've all had too much Zoom. So to take the time out of your evening to be with us, I'm full of gratitude. Thank you very much.
Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you to our brilliant speakers. It's been an incredibly energizing event. Thank you.